thank you very much to the organising committee, to the chairperson, Dr. Naveen Mehta, and to Dr. Tarun Patel as well for the invitation. It's so exciting to be here and to hear, just your enthusiasm for English literature. It's just such a privilege to be able to come and share a little bit of my work with you. Yes, I am very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts about what I will be saying as well about the topic of King Lear and boredom. I will just share my screen. I hope. Oh, it says sharing is not turned on. I might have to.
Yeah, Dr. Ashok, please make ma'am a co-host.
One second, I'm just speaking.
No problems.
Yes, ma'am, you are now co-host. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Just checking that everyone can see that slide there.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So and thank you so much for that brilliant introduction as it was. I hope I can live up to your expectations for this talk. As I said, it's such a privilege and honor to be able to share it with you. As has been indicated, the title of my talk is Beyond Boredom, King Lear, Attentiveness, Neighbourliness and Social Justice. And I thought it might help to give a little bit of a background into the origins of this paper. Hopefully it'll help to see how all the different strands that I'll be bringing together fit together. So firstly, as has already been stated, the paper is part of some early work that I'm doing for a major project on the topic of Shakespeare and neighbourliness. And this project is, I think, the first major study of Shakespeare and neighbourliness. And the project investigates the profound and influential tradition of neighbourliness, particularly in the West, encapsulated in the very familiar biblical phrase, love thy neighbour as thyself. And I'm conducting this investigation by analysing Shakespeare's intense theatrical exploration of that ethic of neighbourly love, alongside the ethic's historical, theological and philosophical underpinnings. And Shakespeare's era, as you may well know, was a pivotal moment in the intellectual and cultural history of neighbourliness. And in my particular project, I will probably be focusing on a number of Shakespeare's plays, including As You Like It, The Merry Wives of Windsor, The Merchant of Venice, Coriolanus, Henry V, The Winter's Tale, and of course, King Lear. And these plays, I think, and as I explore, I hope, show Shakespeare's preoccupation with understanding the ethic of neighbourliness that was so influential in his own era. So that was the first, I guess, prompt for this talk. The second was a symposium that I participated in about this time last year on the future of literary education. And they were down in Melbourne in Australia. I'm in Sydney, Australia. And this symposium brought together about 30 English literature scholars and higher education teachers from Australia and other countries as well. And we were asking about that question, does literary education have a future? And I mean, it's so exciting being here with you, so many of you, to say that it definitely has a future in your context. My particular panel was entitled, What is Literary Education For? So I was asked to present some thoughts about that question. As the title of the symposium might suggest, the whole premise of our different panels was that the humanities generally and literary studies specifically are currently under a lot of pressure, at least in the context in which I work. So literary studies is struggling to make a case for itself in an age of neoliberal and technocratic authoritarianism. And in the symposium, we discussed the question of if there is a future for literary education and what that future might look like. And I'd certainly be keen to hear your perspectives on this issue if we have time later as well. So that were the two prompts over the last year or more that are coming together in this particular paper for me. And so as such, I'll be moving from discussions of literary education and King Lear and bridging those two topics will be ideas of boredom, attentiveness, neighbourliness, and social justice. And I'm particularly engaged with two key 20th and 21st century thinkers about these topics, Simone Weil, and the philosopher, and Kevin Gary. And this is very much a work in progress. I definitely appreciate your feedback on your thoughts. So as this paper focuses on King Lear, thought it might be helpful just to spend a minute or two providing a quick, albeit inadequate plot summary. I certainly don't want to assume that everyone has either seen or read the play. And if you're like me, even if you have, and it was a while ago, you may have forgotten sort of the general outline. So this is a cartoon version I just picked up that I thought might just help us to sort of orientate us to the play itself. So it says there, as it says, King Lear divides his kingdom between his three daughters. He has a tantrum and banishes his youngest daughter, Cordelia. Edmund frames his brother Edgar for wanting to kill their father, Gloucester. Goneril and Regan, the other two daughters of Lear, refuse to host Lear and his entourage after he had actually divided the kingdom. Lear goes mad, wanders around in a storm with his fool and the disguised Edgar, who's disguised as poor Tom, as well as his disguised loyal Kent as well. Gloucester tries to help Lear and gets his eyes gouged out. Cordelia returns with an army to restore Lear to the throne. Goneril and Regan both fall in love with Edmund. Edmund captures Lear and Cordelia. Edgar kills Edmund in single combat. Goneril is jealous of her sister, poisons her, and then stabs herself. In true tragic form, there are a lot of bodies, and Cordelia is hanged, Lear dies, and we could say everyone is miserable. So that's one person's quick summary of the play, which I hope might help sort of orientate us to all the different parts that I'll be pulling out in the presentation. So I'll begin the body of this talk with a question. And that question is, so why does King Lear abdicate his power and hand over his land? And as that sketch showed, divide his kingdom. Many people over such a famous play, and there's so much scholarship about it. So many people have naturally had their theories about this question. For example, there's an opinion that perhaps Lear is a victim of ageism, or in very stark contrast, perhaps Lear is playing God, handing out land to his daughters, just like the biblical God does for Abraham and his descendants in the book of Genesis. Some scholars argue that along those lines that Lear is playing God. And there are, of course, many other theories. You may well have your own. I'll be focusing on the reasons which Lear himself gives for his actions in the play's opening scene. As he says there, "'Tis our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths, while we unburdened crawl toward death." Lear, according to his own account from those lines, would like to live his last years unshackled from his obligations to the subjects, the people, and the body politic he's responsible for ruling and protecting, to shake all cares and business from our age. He seeks to do what a monarch by law cannot do. And now and as he says in the next quote, "Now we will divest us both of rule, interest of territory, cares of state." And soon after, which he soon after says, sandwiched between the love test which he dictates to his daughters, which would determine how he will distribute the territory that is not his to divide. So as it says there, "Tell me, my daughters, which of you shall we say doth love us most?" So why does Lear exchange power and land for ceremonial expressions of filial love? I want to suggest that boredom plays a part in the king's wish to free himself of the duties of being Britain's sovereign while retaining its honours, the name and or the addition to a king, as he says. That is, I want to argue that we can read the motivations Lear offers, the speech acts he requires of his daughters, and his behaviour in the play's opening scene as symptomatic of his bored state of mind. Now, this may strike us as an unexpected diagnosis. Lear is bored. This statement of mine certainly requires some defending. First of all, what I'm not doing is equating Shakespeare's character with the child or any child who declares, I'm bored 10 minutes after starting an activity and who demands immediate relief. In the situation for this child, the source of boredom is environmental, external to the self, while boredom itself is an unpleasant sensation, which seemingly descends instantaneously upon its passive targets, that self-described bored child. Instead, in this paper, I draw on Kevin Gary's account of boredom in his recent book, Why Boredom Matters: Education and the Quest for a Meaningful Life. And noting that boredom is particularly endemic in capitalist societies, Gary gives an initial catch-all definition of boredom as a state of mind, or more specifically, a state of disinterest that works against individuals and communities, embodying the meaningful life that we can see there in his title. So that is, while external circumstances provide the conditions of boredom, Gary's argument is that its origins lie within the self. Moreover, boredom is more than a fleeting emotion, but rather an unpleasant and ubiquitous mood state. Boredom can entrench itself within the self. So in Gary's assessment, our usual responses to boredom, either frantic avoidance or in contrast, acquiescent resignation, are unhelpful. Both avoidance and resignation sidestep the present day imperative to get at the root causes of and thus adequately address what Gary calls the problem of boredom. And as Gary's title suggests, his specific focus is the role of education and educational institutions. So diagnosing schools as more often than not driven by either or both avoidance or resignation agendas, Gary makes the following somewhat provocative claim. Schools, Gary argues, have failed to equip their students with an essential tool for navigating contemporary life if these students graduate without the ability to endure boredom or discern when to accept boredom or when or how to challenge it. I take it that his claim applies equally to universities, especially as Gary contends that students take the responses to boredom which they absorb in the school classroom into the rest of their lives. And not only university life, but into workplaces and bus queues, into hospital waiting rooms, and into what he calls the grinding monotony of old age. And he summarises his arguments by saying, by ignoring the problem of boredom, we ignore a fundamental struggle with being human. And so to put his title to use, Boredom Matters, more specifically, addressing boredom in the classroom matters. At this point in this discussion, I think a significant question, it seems to me, is why is boredom a problem? Or otherwise put, what exactly is the problem of boredom or with boredom? Before I address this issue, it is noteworthy that not all commentators consider boredom a problem. And this is especially true of more recent thinking about boredom. So for instance, Peter Toohey, in his 2011 book, Boredom, A Lively History, he argues that boredom, like most emotions, is what he calls an adaptive emotion. Likening boredom to a mild form of disgust and noting the protective function of disgust, Toohey suggests that boredom has evolved over time to help humans negotiate social situations. Boredom encourages the beneficial rejection of toxic situations, according to Toohey. Meanwhile, Andreas Elpidourou and Josefa Ros Velasco, in their bibliographic survey of the history of the philosophy of boredom, cite several recent empirical and empirically informed studies of boredom that argue for boredom as the impetus for a range of psychological and cognitive benefits, including goal setting, the exercise of agency, and creative and reflective thinking. In contrast to these perspectives, Kevin Gary is much more reticent to champion the benefits of boredom. He gives two reasons for his framing of boredom as a problem, and they are that boredom is both a social issue and a moral issue. So first, boredom is a social issue. boredom is a social issue because boredom, as I've already alluded to, underpins capitalism. And as Gary writes, in a capitalist society, producers often want people to dread boredom and be unreflective about it. And so consumption becomes simply a knee-jerk antidote to it, to the extent that the collective bored state of humanity fuels a level of needless and wanton consumption that our world cannot sustain. And perhaps not surprisingly, here Gary echoes 20th century European sociologists such as Henri Lefebvre and Georg Simmel, who especially emphasized the connectedness of capitalism and boredom. Further, defining boredom as a state of disinterest underlines why boredom is also a moral issue. Disinterest is a choice, a mindset that is not unaffected by individual circumstances or environment, but also not determined by these. And so here we are approaching the root causes of boredom. Doing so, according to Gary, requires taking up an historical lens to better understand boredom. And he strongly contends that in the modern world, we have lost sight of the moral aspects of boredom. Even more to the point, it's crucial that we recover a perspective of boredom as, in Gary's words, a serious moral concern. For, in his words, boredom negatively impacts both our moral reasoning and our vision of human flourishing. So Gary takes his readers back to a key ancient conceptual forerunner of what we now might call boredom, the state of mind captured by the medieval notion of acedia. Acedia means lack of care. And so here we can see the parallels between acedia and being in a state of disinterest. So acedia was first coined in relation to the monastic life to describe the lack of care or disinterest that could infect individuals as they undertook the same religious routine day in and day out. The application of acedia expanded over time to first experience of scholars. You may be able to relate to that, and then even more so into popular usage. The 4th century monk Evagrius was the first person to classify acedia as a deadly or root sin. Indeed, for Evagrius, acedia is the most hazardous of all the foundational sins, because it is the breeding ground for a multitude of other sins, including greed, envy, and sloth. So, acedia could imperil one's soul. To suffer with acedia is to let oneself go, to become careless about one's interior life. And that quote shows how we can trace boredom to its roots in the self. More than that, Gary employs the term attributed to St. Augustine, incubatus in se, to argue that boredom stems from being consumed with oneself. Boredom is a form of incubatus in se, of being turned in on oneself because one is infected with pride. And in the 16th century, early modern theologians, especially Martin Luther, reprised this unflattering image of the self. And drawing on this picture of pride-driven selves curving in upon themselves, as well as Chad Stutz's provocatively titled article, Wisława Szymborska, Adolf Hitler and Boredom in the Classroom, or How Yawning Leads to Genocide, Gary describes boredom as more than a psychological state. So, quick drink here. Boredom is more than a psychological state. It's also a volitional and totalizing move. Boredom disposes one to totalize as the bored, incurved self forecloses on the possibility of attaining new knowledge of oneself or the world. The bored self adopts a posture of dismissiveness, which manifests in half-listening, in ways of thinking and seeing that withhold attention from that which exists beyond oneself. And it's this image of the bored self who totalizes by excluding as they direct their gaze, thus their attention, to themselves, that first suggested to me the potential of bringing King Lear together with the rich yet neglected moral dimensions of boredom that the concept has accrued over its long history. So in this presentation, I both turn to Shakespeare's play to further understand and illustrate boredom as a moral and ethical issue with social and political repercussions, And I turn to thinking about boredom to illuminate Shakespeare's play. Towards the end of the paper, I will more briefly offer some preliminary reflections on King Lear as a case study that explores how literary studies might play a role in helping students to look beyond themselves and navigate boredom. And I imagine that for many of us, King Lear is the first character, although by no means the only one, who comes to mind in any discussion of how Shakespeare prompts his audience to consider the morality and implications of choosing what, or more to the point, who one does and does not look at, who one is interested in and who one is not interested in. That seeing and not seeing, blindness are of course prominent tropes in King Lear, the play. Shakespeare often employs them to associate characters' actions of focusing their attention on themselves with impaired moral reasoning and a skewed view of reality. Perhaps most memorably in Act 4, Gloucester, after he has had his eyes brutally gouged out and is cast out of his own home by Cornwall and Regan, poignantly observes, I have no way and therefore want no eyes. I stumbled when I saw. Taking us back to the play's opening scene, Lear avails himself of the language of sight to wield power. To wield that power, he has ostensibly said that he is in the process of relinquishing, but to wield it over any person who attempts to set right his moral incurvature. I've got some quotations there that I'll just reflect on briefly. So choosing not to see is a relational act. And Lear equates banishing Cordelia from his side with both disinheriting her and even more bitterly with not loving her. So hence, and avoid my sight. We have no such daughter, nor shall ever see that face of hers again. Choosing not to see is also a moral decision. Kent urges Lear to see better. But rather than choosing to do so, to see better, the king insists on maintaining his narrow focus on himself. First via his bitter declaration that Cordelia has thwarted his plan to spend his twilight years in her care. And second, by aligning himself with Burgundy, who, like Lear, sees other human beings as commodities, assigning them cash value, as Sophie Ward puts it. Moreover, if his daughters are on the open market, so to speak, it is Lear himself who decides their value. Cordelia's price, the king announces to Burgundy, is fallen, and the Duke agrees. The play, of course, situates theatre-goers and readers to question its protagonist's choices about who he looks at and how he sees. Shakespeare's first audiences would have picked up on the biblically resonant language in this first scene. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10, the Apostle Paul, reflective of a wider biblical emphasis on the upside-down subjectivity affected by divine grace, depicts himself as one who is sorrowing and yet always rejoicing, as poor and yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing all things. And as you can see there on the slide, France undoes Lear's and Burgundy's commodifying way of seeing others in ways that distinctly echo that biblical quotation. Fairest Cordelia, that art most rich, being poor, not all the dukes of waterish Burgundy can buy this unprized precious maid of me. Elsewhere in the scene, the language the king reaches for in his totalizing rejection of Cordelia also calls to mind well-known biblical ideas. And here Lear reverses Scripture's foundational ethical injunction, love thy neighbour as thyself, which in its first iteration in the book of Leviticus is closely followed by the additional command to love the stranger as thyself. Kenneth Graham points out Lear's unusual use of neighbour and also stranger as verbs. The king effectively unneighbours Cordelia by declaring her to be as irrelevant to him as the most distant stranger. Indeed, more than that, wholly repugnant to him. New adopted to our hate, dowered with our curse, and strangered with our oath. Take her or leave her. And as a stranger to my heart, Lear to Cordelia, and as a stranger to my heart and me, hold thee from this forever. the barbarous Scythian, or he that makes his generation messes to gorge his appetite, shall to my bosom be as well neighboured, pitied, and relieved as thou my sometime daughter. As commentators note, in the early modern imagination, the ancient nomadic people from the region of Scythia were legendary for their savagery, while one who gorges oneself on his generation messes is a cannibal who eats his offspring. In contrast to the biblical text, Lear separates the stranger from the neighbour. Rather than loving the stranger and the stranger neighbour as oneself, to Lear the stranger is a despised other. And by designating Cordelia both a stranger and an object of his hate, Lear embodies the antithesis of the biblical ethic of loving his neighbour as himself. This ethic was especially influential in Shakespeare's day. The biblical language of neighbourly love permeated early modern English culture, providing the idiom for that society's vision of community and the individual as a relational subject within it. In church, Shakespeare and his contemporaries often heard the call to love thy neighbour as thyself, while teaching on the ethic appears in countless religious texts. But the ethics influence was felt far beyond the churchyard. The language of neighbourly love features in artefacts as varied as commonplace recipe books, letters and diaries, government decrees, popular chapbooks, civic records, and even kitchen implements of all things. Andy Wood just demonstrates that for ordinary people, the ethic of neighbourly love fed into their everyday patterns of social interaction. Shakespeare's play shows his preoccupation with the theologically inflected ethic of neighbourliness. Lear's language, for instance, seems very close to this passage from a sermon on Galatians by the influential Protestant reformer John Calvin, although Shakespeare's character, of course, reverses the reformer's sentiments. I'll just read a little bit of this. He that will exempt himself from relieving his neighbours must get him a new shape and show that he intendeth to be no more a man. For so long as we be of mankind, we cannot but behold our own face as it were in a glass, in the person that is poor and despised, and so forth. So here Calvin is teasing out the implications of Galatians 6:10, which states, while we have therefore time, let us do good unto all men, but especially unto them which are of the household of faith. And Calvin does not equivocate. When one looks at another, even the furthest stranger in the world, as he writes there, one sees a brother and a neighbour, a fellow human who, by virtue of our common humanity, is so like oneself that refusing to do good to this person exposes one's own lack of humanity. Calvin's allusion to Moors and barbarians, like Shakespeare's to the barbarous Scythian, is of course very uncomfortable for us today. But I think the point Calvin is making is true. We do find it harder to neighbour, to do good to those who are different, however we define different, in specific cultural moments. And that this is the action that Calvin is calling his hearers to is, as a colleague recently remarked, quite astonishing. Before Calvin, Luther had argued that loving one's neighbour as oneself, which Lear refuses to do, is the action that lifts the gaze of incurved selves, of whom it doesn't seem, I don't think it seems a stretch to say that Lear is emblematic, away from themselves. Here is Lear's interpretation, Luther's interpretation of Romans 15:2. It's written in his characteristically vivid style. And I just read the part in bold there. You are completely curved in upon yourself and pointed toward love of yourself, and get a condition from which you will not be delivered unless you altogether cease loving yourself and forgetting yourself, love your neighbour. So I'll come back to this opposition of neighbourliness and curving in upon oneself, as well as to King Lear in a couple of minutes. Although as a quick aside, I do want to stress that my reading of Lear as bored and turned in upon himself in the play's opening scenes in no way justifies other characters' cruel, unneighbourly treatment of him in the rest of the play. But for a couple of minutes, I will return briefly to the question of education and have another drink first. So back to Kevin Gary, who in his book accords education a significant role in both resisting capitalism's relentless fomenting of boredom and in helping students develop morally. And in Gary's words, at its most elementary level, the process of education is guiding students how to learn how to pay attention. Educators and educational institutions can help students do more than avoid or become resigned to boredom. Fostering in students a capacity for attentiveness is key to this mission. Gary makes a distinction within the faculty of attention, and he employs Thomas Aquinas's contrast between ratio and intellectualist ways of knowing to argue that the former, ratio, the sort of rationality that we package up in modern day edu-speak as critical thinking, is the dominant mode of attentiveness that modern education seeks to develop as students learn to assess, analyse, evaluate, interpret, integrate, demonstrate, apply, compare, critique, and so on. To Gary, the task of educators is to balance this analytical mode of attentiveness with a recovery of intellectual attentiveness, knowing given as a gift of illumination, which cultivates in students appreciation, wonder, admiration. And here, Gary briefly nods to Simone Weil, the early 20th century French philosopher, teacher, social activist, and Christian mystic, whose thinking about the ethics of attention has increasingly become interesting to educationists. And so it's they who I'm now bringing into this conversation. In her essay, The Right Use of School Studies, Bay contends that the development of the faculty of attention forms the real object and almost the sole interest of studies. Most school tasks have a certain intrinsic interest as well, she writes, but such an interest is secondary. So Bay does not dismiss the intellectual achievements of study, but she does subordinate them to this goal of developing students' capacity for attention. And for Bay, the stakes are high. Helping students learn to pay attention is for her an ethical endeavour. Reminiscent of Aquinas' intellectualist knowing, Bay describes the habit and power of attention that studies should nurture as a posture of openness. Such openness is characterised by a humility that recognises that there is much that one does not know and therefore does not foreclose knowing, and humility coupled with a preparedness to wait for and receive the truth contained in the object of one's study. For they, learning to pay attention in this sort of way, be it to a geometry problem or a Latin text, or indeed a Shakespearean play, decenters the egocentric self. That is the incurved self. Not that they specifically refers to incurvatus in se, but it's very close to that idea of the egocentric self. So decentering of this self opens up the possibility of self-forgetfulness, of paying deep attention to something outside oneself. For they, learning in the classroom to attend to that which is beyond the self has far-reaching ethical significance, as such attentiveness is a substance of the love of our neighbour. As she writes, love for our neighbour, being made of creative attention, is analogous to genius. Iris Murdoch, the 20th century Irish and British novelist and philosopher, drew significantly on Bay's thinking for her own definition of love, which she says is the perception of individuals. Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. It is the apprehension of something else, something particular as existing outside us. Creative attention especially allows the self to look outward at one's real particular neighbour who is afflicted and ask, what are you going through? To reminiscent of Calvin's image of beholding and neighbouring the person that is poor and despised, notice someone who is afflicted and see them as being as much a person as I am. And I particularly use the term afflicted here rather than, for instance, suffering, as it is Weil's preferred term. For Weil, the greatest enigma of human life is not suffering, it is what she calls malheur, affliction. Affliction is the mark of the person who has been crushed by force and reduced to a thing, so dehumanized. Just as Cordelia is by Lear, and as Lear and Gloucester are by Cornwall and his gang. Peter Roberts expands on Weil's emphasis on attention as the preferred ethical response to one's afflicted neighbour. When someone is afflicted, what is needed is not sympathy or charity, but attention. Sympathy can separate, attention connects. Charity keeps us at a distance from affliction. Attention demands engagement. Attention calls us to act not because we feel sorry for someone, but because as a fellow individual human sufferer, they already have a certain dignity and demand respect. So to Vey, love of neighbour expressed as particularised attention to another individual is the essence of social justice. For every particular instance of loving attention toward a fellow human being is at once a commitment to all. And when others suffer, this is our suffering too. In her words, the gospel makes no distinction between the love of our neighbour and justice. Vey mentions King Lear several times in her writings. To Vey, Shakespeare was at the peak of what she calls his genius when he wrote Lear, which for her means that in Lear, Shakespeare found words that faithfully represent the experience of the afflicted. Vey groups together the afflicted characters she has in mind as the play's fools. And these characters are the actual fool, as well as poor Tom, Edgar disguised as poor Tom, and more abstractly, the poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that by the pelting of this pitiless storm, with houseless heads and unfed sides. These are the placeless, faceless collective of the afflicted for, or is it to, whom Lear prays in Act 3, Scene 4, as he himself is buffeted by the pitiless storm. Together, these characters, the fool et al., represent for Vey a class of people in this world who have fallen into the lowest degree of humiliation, far below beggary. The people about whom popular opinion has decided are deprived of the specific human dignity of reason. To Vey in Lear, Shakespeare found words that convey the pain of the afflicted, the words she writes, which can give resonance through the crust of external circumstances, to the cry which is always paradoxically inaudible. Why am I being hurt? So as the storm rages in Act 3, does Lear begin to hear this cry by looking outward and seeing others who are afflicted? Does he learn to pay particular loving attention to other individuals, to see better? Or we could ask, is he no longer bored? Has he changed? Many critics would argue that yes, he has changed, and highlighting Lear's prayer for the poor naked wretches as the turning point in his ethical development. That is, as Lindsay Laris summarises while disagreeing, the scene depicts a triumph of transcendent or transformative compassion. Like Lara, I'm not so sure. Or perhaps better, I think it's complicated. So certainly prior to his prayer, Lear notices his fool's discomfort a couple of scenes earlier. Come on, my boy, how dost my boy, art cold? And in acknowledging that he too is cold, the king, it seems, also recognises their common humanity. Yet, Lear's attentiveness to the fool follows just after the king had insisted, I am a man more sinned against than sinning. In claiming that the scales of wrongdoing and injustice are weighted against him, Lear does not yet see his responsibility as his nation's sovereign for the endemic corruption and misuse of power that have now been turned against him. That is the social and political fallout, which the fool describes in his prophecy a few lines later. When priests are more in word than matter, when brewers mar their malt with water, and so forth. The quotation continues. Perhaps Lear does come to this realisation as he prays for the poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are. Here it appears that the king is confessing his negligence and seeking to make some amends for the inequities that are coming to his attention. Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Here we can hear echoes of acedia, of lack of care, or of disinterest in these poignant words. Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Expresses a sentiment that just might help make the world a little bit better today, I feel, if it's taken on by some who wield power in our world. And similarly, we can ask what difference it might make if, like Lear, the powerful ask that they feel what wretches feel so that they can shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just. Lear prays for this indistinct aggregate of wretches who are somewhere, but not where he is. But then he meets poor Tom, a unique instance of Lear's abstraction, a particular neighbour. Tom is exactly where Lear is. And as soon as Lear lays eyes on poor Tom, the king sees himself. Not in the way that Calvin and Vey urge their audiences to see a fellow person, to see a neighbour who is as human as them in the face of another. Instead, Lear's response to Tom suggests that the king sees only himself in the newcomer, only his own resentments. Didst thou, Tom, give all to thy daughters? And art thou come to this? And have his daughters brought him to this pass? And here I tend to agree with Lara. Lara argues that while Lear's prayer signals his nascent turn towards compassion, his encounter with Tom awakens in the king a contradictory, indulgent turn inwards to self-pity as he externalizes his own misery and hangs it awkwardly on poor Tom. They may help us understand Lear's response. Faye stresses that attending to another person, especially a person marked by affliction, a person turned into a thing, into unaccommodated man, a poor, bare-forked animal, as Lear describes Tom, is not an easy endeavour. For this person is, in Alan Jacobs' summary of A, too present. Everything in us wants to turn away, and I would add, retreat inward, incubatus in se. Lear, I suggest, is not a story of the triumph of attentiveness over boredom. That is to say that in bringing together Shakespeare's play with boredom and attentiveness as significant moral and ethical categories, I'm not reading King Lear as charting for its audience its hero's overcoming of boredom, however belated and futile and thus tragic this metamorphosis might actually be. Rather, I'm arguing that Shakespeare shows us and helps us feel the discomfort inherent in the choice to look, rather than turn away and remain disinterested. The choice to resist boredom by paying loving attention to one's neighbour and in enacting justice, as well as the cost of so doing. And we may most acutely see and feel this cost at a very surprising moment in the play. As Cornwall is about to cruelly remove Gloucester's second eye, Cornwall's own servant intervenes. Hold your hand, my lord. I have served you ever since I was a child, but better service have I never done you than now to bid you hold. With the removal of his first eye, Gloucester had become marked by affliction, reduced to a thing by Cornwall. Gloucester's objection makes him too present to all in the room, including, I note, the audience. The servant could choose to turn away, to not pay attention. Instead, he chooses to see Gloucester, addressing him as my lord, just as he had Cornwall, and to see the injustice committed by one lord against the other. This lowly servant, Regan calls him a dog, recalls France's earlier allusion to Paul's paradox in 2 Corinthians 6:10, poor and yet making many rich, as he refuses Lear's reduction of Cordelia to a commodity and instead chooses to see her for her virtues. Inevitably, for the servant, death is the cost of making others rich, the cost of attentiveness to another. But this outcome does not render his deeds meaningless. As Peter Holbrook observes, via a messenger to Albany, the play later dignifies the servant's actions by recounting them in the language of high tragedy. That language being a servant that he, bred, thrilled with remorse, opposed against the act, bending his sword to his great master. If the servant is Shakespeare's character who especially shows us what it means to embody particularized, costly attentiveness towards others, what about Lear? In a longer version of this paper, I will suggest in more details that if Lear does learn to see better, it may be because he experiences being seen, in the sense that he's curving in upon himself, is exposed to himself and others, and yet being loved by Cordelia. Or otherwise put, while Lear thinks he has lost the love of the daughter he had unneighboured, the daughter he had strangered, that she has cause for spurning him, Cordelia overturns his expectations. No cause, as she extends neighbourly love to him, including seeking justice for him. For thee, oppressed king, I am cast down. So elaborating on this point is my task for a longer paper. But for now, I'd like to return us to the question of education and draw on this discussion of Lear, they, boredom, and attentiveness to offer a couple of very preliminary thoughts. And I'll just check the time there. Can someone tell me how much time we have left for this?
5 minutes, ma'am.
5 minutes, okay. So I'll just give a few brief thoughts. Thank you very much. So if Gary and Bay are onto something, then literary studies takes its place alongside other areas of study as contributing to helping students learn ethical attentiveness to that which is not oneself, attentiveness as an antidote to boredom and as an act of justice. So how, in particular, does or might literary study nourish deep formative attentiveness in students and scholars? And I'll be just give some brief thoughts about this. First of all, I'd like to suggest that literary studies could show a greater interest in ethics than it has in the last half century or so, at least in my subfield of early modern literature. And doing so involves seeing human beings as ethical subjects, as relational or intersubjective selves, and thus locating literary representations of human subjectivity in what Patrick Gray and John Cox term a fertile middle ground between anti-humanism's bounded self and the autonomous self of the Enlightenment. That is, we are neither predominantly shaped and bounded by forces outside ourselves, nor predominantly autonomous human agents who can freely choose our actions. The nature of literature itself suggests the appropriateness of ethical reflection in the literature classroom. In Lear and Semler's words, there is life in English like no other subject. Literature is, of course, an outpouring of life, and the work of literature in the classroom should be a circulation of life. As such, because literature embodies life, literature prompts the question of how to live, as Andy Mousley puts it. This is a simply phrased question with no easy answers. How to live, or more specific versions of this question, such as how does one love one's neighbour, are knotty questions because of the nature of both literature and human experience and their relation with one another. Literature overflows with life in all its concrete particularity and diversity. And because literary texts do not foreclose knowing, but instead prompt us to ask more questions, discussing them in the classroom can foster a posture of openness that cultivates attentiveness to others. And I hope it's clear that I'm not arguing for a blunt moralism, but rather as Eklund and Hyman put it in their text, Teaching Social Justice Through Shakespeare, because our interpretive work rests on literary texts that are themselves sites of contested meaning, we can reproduce in our classrooms smaller, less risky versions of the struggles present in our aspects of our institutional and social lives. For example, one of those authors regularly asks their students, what can you change your mind about today? Or I would add, we could also ask, who can you change your mind about today? And finally, and perhaps more obviously, literary works and other works of art lend themselves especially well, as we know, to intellectuous attentiveness, to recap to a posture of openness that sees knowing as a gift of illumination, which cultivates appreciation, wonder, and admiration, or as Rita Felsky puts it in Uses of Literature, aesthetic absorption. Such absorption can focus the attention of students and scholars alike on the particularities of language or characterization or a narrative in ways that, in Felsky's words, confounds our deeply held beliefs about the rationality and autonomy of persons. And so thinking specifically about King Lear, today Shakespeare's play exemplifies the beauty of the representation of affliction. Intellectual attentiveness can open us up as readers and students to the personhood of afflicted others as we appreciate, admire, and absorb this representation. Or as Peter Holbrook writes, we could usefully replace a fixation on rational critique with what Richard Rorty calls the cultivation of humane feelings through the telling of sad and sentimental stories about people less fortunate than ourselves. And so it's with this prompt to allow literary text to help us better pay attention to others, and in the words of Shakespeare's Gloucester, to see feelingly, that I'll end and turn the discussion over to you if we have any time. I would love to hear your thoughts about that question of how we might, in particular, see literary study as nourishing formative attentiveness in students and scholars. I'm very happy to discuss any other questions about what I've spoken about. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much again for the invitation to speak with you.